it has been quite some while since my last video, but here we are today, and we're actually gonna take a look at a tune. And we're gonna start off with a bad tune, simply because I want you to be able to understand what really makes a bad tune. Now to the basics. This is a T7 tune. And the engine in this case was a B205E with biopower, so E85, while the base file itself was made for a 2.3 liter engine. Why this matters, we're gonna see it later on. One thing you need to know about the B205E is that it comes with a GT17 turbocharger. And that thing is not really reliable at high mileage. It's also not made for spirited driving, or let's say for driving under high load all the time. And therefore, like the general consensus, the 230 HP are kinda considered as a maximum. But even then it's kinda questionable how reliable it's gonna be on the long run. Saab therefore only intended this turbocharger for low boost applications. And if you want to upgrade, or let's say you want to go the next step, then you definitely have to go for a 15T. Here we can see a picture of a very typical damage, which you will find with these turbochargers. This was at around 280,000 kilometers, but actually bought a car once with around 200,000, where it was even damaged worse than that. But now to the file. So what do we see here? The blue line, that's the torque, the red line is the HP, dark green lambda, and the black one is simply the fuel flow. And on first sight, I must say, it looks okay to me. I noticed one thing, but you're gonna see about it in a minute. Let's first draw a conclusion. So, it's reasonable, but the torque is maybe a bit high, depends on the mileage of the car, but if the clutch is in good condition or was renewed, you shouldn't worry too much about it. And maybe now you notice a difference already when comparing it with the file on the right. Don't be fooled by how the lines are basically made with a stock Aero file. But have a look how the torque starts. The Aero starts with low torque, and our file starts with 310 Newton meters already. That's kinda interesting, but we're gonna see in a minute. As said, so far, doesn't look too bad. Of course, the Aero tune must be richer, needs more fuel, because larger displacement, more power, more boost. So, yeah. But I mentioned this was E85 compatible, so let's see how this behaves. And you will directly see that the dark green line suddenly goes up in the end. We also see that the power level is at around 250 HP and more than 400 Newton meters of torque. This can't be right, especially not for a B205E. So we are already beyond our HP limit, which is really concerning, because that also means we are pushing a lot of airmass, just like with the torque, which is also not great for the clutch, obviously. But the high lambda value, this concerns me, because a value greater than 1 means we're running very, very lean. And at high load, we don't want to run lean, because this is where the engine is basically stressed the most. And of course, some of you might say now, but Ray, you were the one to tell us that E85 has a very good octane rating, or very high octane rating, and therefore does knock. And that's correct. However, the burning properties of E85 are a lot different compared to petrol. So you need around 15 to 35% more fueling. The golden rule is 14.7 contents of air to 1 content of petrol. With E85, however, you need 9.8 contents of air to 1 content of fuel. So what's gonna happen? It's not gonna knock because of a high octane rating, but it's gonna melt or burn the engine at least. Next up, we have a table view. The top row there is going to show us the RPM, and the left column will show us the request, which is modulated by the pedal position. So if we completely depress the accelerator, we will have 100% request, and if we don't press it at all, well, it's obviously 0. And now I put this into comparison with the Aero file, and now you're gonna realize why the numbers are so weird. We are pushing a lot of air compared to an Aero. like 1200 milligrams. That's way more than the Eero does. And I mean, we only wanted to do like 230 HP. And the Eero has 250 stock. So that's really, really alarming already. As said, the Eero has the bigger turbo. And the GT17 is not really reliable, especially when tuned and the car has, done its age. But what about security functions on the ECU? And granted, there are security functions which are supposed to prevent overboosting, but not if you tamper with them. And what you also need to know is that the security functions are sort of chained to each other to prevent damage. So only if this chain is still existing, they're gonna work. Therefore, I ran a comparison, and as you can see, there are a lot of changes in this file, which is very weird actually, because you don't need to change that much. But you will also realize that some security functions, which we're gonna take a look at now, have been tampered with. First up, knock detection. On the left, you can see the stock file, as said, the completely unmodified file this is based on, and on the right, the ProTuner. And what you need to know is that this map has basically to be based on the displacement of the engine. So the 2.3 liter knock detection is going to look different than the 2 liter one. And now you may ask, how does the 2 liter one look like? Like the left one. Of course, you're going to say, no, this is a B205L. It doesn't really make much of a difference. If you don't believe me, don't hesitate. Get a T7 binary for a B205 and compare it. It's going to look a lot like the one on the left, but not anywhere near compared to the one on the right. So what's my conclusion from this? The changes are completely pointless, and that's very dangerous, of course. And to actually calibrate them, and this is another thing I need to point out here, you need specialized equipment, which is very expensive and which you can't just connect and it's gonna work. So therefore you should never ever touch these maps. Not even Hirsch has done it. Not Mapton does it. No one does it. Next up, misfire detection. The values in the cells are basically airmass. Left is stock, and it doesn't matter this time which displacement your engine has, and right is the ProTuner. And no matter which file you're gonna open, this is also something no ProTuner is gonna change first of all, but the values will never look like the one on the right. And therefore, the misfire detection isn't able to work properly. We have deactivated, or let's say heavily reduced misfire detection, which is also very dangerous and, to be honest, very dumb as well. But let's also talk about maximum airmass. This is a map you need to change when you tune, so it's very legitimate that they've changed it, and this is why I also didn't mark it in the very first screenshot. So you need to adjust it, right? As said, of course you do, but you will notice a huge difference when you compare our ProTuner to an actual ProTuner, to Hirsch. Hirsch has a very secure and safe approach with some thought in mind compared to the one on the left. And it gets even worse when you compare it with a stock Eero file. Because when you're going to realize that it's just around 50 to 80 milligrams shy of a real Eero. And when you look at the values more to the left, you're basically well above the Eero. This is really dangerous. The next limiter is the so-called fuel cut. How this works is that it compares the actual airmass with the requested airmass by the pedal. And there's like a fixed value you can enter in a table, and if this value has been reached or exceeded, it's gonna stop fuel injection so that the engine can no longer accelerate. And sometimes you need to adjust it around 50 to 100 milligrams maximum, unless you're running a crazy build, because the stock values are already very high. And this is sort of like the last resort if all the other security functions fail. Left stock, right ProTuner. 1350 might not seem like a lot, but that's actually what's used for the Eero or Wing models. And keep in mind, the 15T can be pushed up to 1400 milligrams and it can survive it just fine, but that's sadly for GT17. The next map is basically related to the APC. And it tells us that when we have detected a fault with APC, so with our boost controller, that we should limit the air mass. And usually we would limit it to 600 milligrams. Here we set it to 1250. So we have basically disabled this security function entirely. We rendered it useless. But what about the actual tuning? There have been changes to the boost calibration which are needed because, this calibration depends on the displacement. But in this case, they're not even factory values. They should have just copied the factory values, but they didn't do it. They set their own custom random values, which make no sense at all. And I can only tell you as much that not even Hirsch nor Maptun touch these kind of maps, because it's unnecessary. You only need to adjust this when you have a custom turbocharger. What about ignition? I mentioned in my last video that knocking can be mitigated by reducing ignition timing, but you can also make it worse by over-timing the ignition. And we're gonna take a look at the ignition table next, and I marked some useless changes in the purple circle, and I also marked some stuck values in the yellow one. And you can see that we are well overtimed with 41 degrees, because 40 degrees is the maximum you can do. And funny enough, compare the two ignition tables, left the Pro Tuner, right Hirsch. Hirsch is running more aggressive ignition angles, which translate to better acceleration compared to our Pro Tuner. So what's my overall conclusion? A lot of unneeded maps have been changed, and what's unforgivable is that security functions have been tampered or completely deactivated. And I can also say as much about this, that the vehicle owner had massive problems with his car, especially on E85, like the car wouldn't even start when it was like 10 to 15 degrees outside. And it's not just this single person. I reviewed a lot of files, and I also spoke with other people who didn't send me the file, but I still spoke with them, who also confirmed that this is a well-known problem. But when the customers try to speak with the company is like, no, this must be your car's fault. But obviously we can see that something isn't right with the tune in the first place. And if they mention their problems in public, they earn a huge shitstorm. Now some of you might ask me, how many maps do you change? And this is a very good example of a stage 1 we sell, B235R on petrol. So of course we won't have the E85 maps in here. And you can see I also adjusted the fuel cut. I increased it around 50 milligrams. And we also disabled the second oxygen sensor because the customer didn't have it. We used a very new base file, but the vehicle was pre-2002, so just one lambda. And yeah, that's about it. This is not anywhere comparable to the one we just saw. Some final words to this. I reviewed around 25 files in total, and initially I had the idea that I would upload them, but then I figured it's not so clever. Simply because I don't want to point with my finger at a company and call them out, first of all, but also because I want to keep it sort of private who own the vehicles. But then again, I can also understand that some people might be in doubt, be like, this is just a made-up story. So therefore, if you really don't believe me, send us a message and I will send you a zip file which contains the tunes, but give me maybe like 1 or 2 days so I can remove the VIN and IMBO numbers. And yeah, that's all I can say and want to say about this. If you have any questions, if there's any concern, or maybe you disagree with me with all the things shown here, feel free to comment. And if there's anything else you would like to see, or any questions, don't hesitate to reach out.